So welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us to the fourth session of Uproot Democracy, a seat for nature. This is the reading room. My name is Jean. You may recognize me from the mails that I signed. Well, I'm very glad to have you all here. I see some people are still joining. For those of you who have been watching before, or for those of you who are new, I'm still going to introduce. This is a series hosted by Framer Framed and Network Democracy, supported by Europe Direct, in which we look at extractivist systems. In the past, we've been looking to extraction in its different phases, in its different guises, from the most direct extractions that we have from the land, the seas, but also in previous panels, stuff like digital extraction. So it's really taking this from a conceptual level all the way to practice. On the last session, which we had online, we had a live stream panel between our guests who are all present here again, representing the Embassy of the North Sea, Anne van Leeuwen, from the Soft Protest Digest, we have Nikki Sigurdsson and Robin Bantigny. Excuse my lack of French. And from Inland, we have Fernando Garcia Dori. So, yeah, last session was very interesting because from these speakers, we had quite different examples of practices, ranging from gardens to seas to the divide between rural areas and cities. We really explored alternative understandings of human and non-human cooperations. We also started going a bit more into the use of fiction and storytelling as a means for environmental justice and alternative representation. But the idea today is that we delve a little bit more into these questions. Last time we also felt, even from the speakers, that there was more stuff to delve into. So today's the day. Amongst other questions that we want to tackle today, there are issues, for example, how to avoid the pitfalls of anthropomorphism, a word that I'm gonna keep mispronouncing, and paternalism when extending representation to non-humans, and looking at what attitudes and tools should we adopt as we restore the equity between non-human organisms, anthropocentric systems, and natural landscapes. Some rules for the reading room is that none of us wrote the actual texts, so none of us is the expert. So feel free if you have any questions, any comments, everything is welcome. We would like to encourage if everyone who joined can leave their mic open. Of course, if their background noise allows it, so that you feel more included and you feel like you can participate. And we will divide the session in sections depending on the text, but again, if you have general questions or comments, just feel free to make your voice heard. So before we delve into it, I think it would be nice to make a little round of introductions. So basically, I think what everyone should say is their name, where they are joining from, and I'm gonna say, state what your, not necessarily your favorite, but any non-human organism or entity that you think is, I don't know, relevant or you find attractive. So again, your name, where you're from, and let's say your favorite plant, animal, mountain, landscape, etc. Anyone wants to start? Otherwise, okay.
Yeah, I'm Nikki Sigurdsson. I'm from Denmark, and I like the flower marigold, because it's also mentioned in the racial chasm text, and it's yellow, and I'm wearing yellow, so I choose that one. Yeah. And Rovan, maybe go.
I would say the thing that comes to my mind right now is I like Geotrichum candidum. It's a yeast that grows on most cheeses, soft cheeses, and it's delicious.
Well, I continue by allusion to the cheese. No, but I was thinking that maybe my name is Fernando Garcia Dori. I'm from Finland, and when you mentioned mountain, I was thinking on fog, and I like very much the fog because it's something that changes the landscape in a very soft and like ephemeral way.
Hi, I'm Anne. I'm joining from Utrecht. And well, I just like trees in general. I think they can become 1,000 years old. That's already amazing. But I lately heard that they also have this something like phyton sites or something that they extract against rotting, but that also makes humans more relaxed. So it's, yeah, I just discover more and more about trees. It's amazing.
I'm Romy. I'm from the Netherlands and I'm currently in Enschede. And I go for mycorrhizal fungi. None in particular, but just because they are very exciting and magical, I find.
Maybe I'll take it. So I'm Jean. I am joining from Amsterdam, and I'm gonna go for birds. I'm gonna go for magpies because from my window here, I can see a magpie nest on the other side of the street. And yeah, it's, I think, the closest animal besides the cat that I have been observing a lot during lockdown. And recently I learned that just as you have a murder of crows, which is kind of an odd name for a congregation, for magpies, the name is a parliament of magpies. So I think that ties into the Latour conversation.
I'm Marlies. I'm joining from Rotterdam. I love trees. I love mountains.
I guess it's my turn.
Many things. Oh, sorry.
My name is Nienke. I'm from the Netherlands, and at this moment we are at Sterksel, and we have a holiday that's called Crocus Holiday, and I'm in a garden with thousands of them. So that's also really nice. But I don't know the name in English. I'm sorry.
Nice. Oh, I'm sorry, Marlies.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm very interested in, and I think the English name is foil at the moment, and I'm studying the form and color, and it's very interesting because it's part of a tree, and it's covering another notemuscat. I forgot the word in English. So this is what I'm currently interested in.
My name is Anne van Leeuwen. I'm calling in from Nijmegen from my regenerative farm Bodemzicht, and I'm one of the board members of the Embassy of the North Sea. So of course I'm gonna say it is the sea, but I'm gonna admit that I also really like the Waddenzee. So there it is.
Oh.
Hi. Hello, I'm joining from Berlin. The name that you will see on the screen is Perry, but my full name is Peregrine. So I will choose the Falcon after which I'm named. The falcon is, I believe, the fastest creature on the planet. And if my eyes were the same proportion of the size of my head, as is true for the falcon, my eyes would be this big.
That's a great name to have. Siswa or Hannah or Ashley? Oh, Siswa, I think you need to unmute. Oh, it's not working. Yeah.
Yeah, hello.
Hi.
Yeah. Now, I'm Siswa Santoso. I'm Indonesian living in Holland already for almost 30 years. I'm based in IJmuiden, small city nearby Haarlem. If you ask me to mention plants which I love, at the moment what is in my head, that is two. The first is a Christmas tree, and the second is a sunflower. And as far as mountain is concerned, you know, I'm from an archipelago where hundreds of mountains have been there. I love one which is called Merapi. This is a volcano, actually, nearby a city where I finished my studies there. That's all from me.
Oh, that's great. Hannah, I think you were.
Yeah, I was gonna start maybe because I didn't catch the first beginning, like the questions that we were supposed to answer.
So just for a round of introductions, it's your name, where you're joining from, and any non-human entity that is either your favorite or you find endearing at the moment.
Mm-hmm. All right. I'm Hanne. I'm joining from Amsterdam, sitting on my balcony because the weather is too good today to be inside. And I think my favorite, I don't know, non-human entity is the Waddenzee. I've been growing up there every holiday, and I don't know. It's just really fascinating and beautiful as well.
And I think Ashley.
Yes, I'm Ashley. I'm also joining from Amsterdam. And not my favorite, but in my garden I just saw some green parrots, and it's actually, there's a little bit of a skirmish going on in our house. Somebody put out these letters saying that if we see green parrots or pigeons or magpies, we should try and get them out of the garden so that the songbirds will stay. Very interesting. So, and I saw somebody's feeding the parrots, so we've got a little infighting, I guess, in the neighborhood with what species of birds we want around.
I think that's everyone. Interesting. Now we form a little eclectic ecosystem. We have parrots, Christmas trees, and sunflowers in the fog and in the sea. Interesting to see also like for example, with the parrots, you have, of course, even slightly a political edge to them, because of course they are a species that migrated, and there are tales about how the parrots got to Amsterdam and now they're considered a pest by many. I don't. But well, so after that brief round, I think it's good to go into the text. My suggestion is to start with Silent Spring, because that's, of course, a very foundational text for all of the ecological movements. So I'm not sure where to start. Maybe there's one quote from the text that I will just say. It's, I think, on the PDF that we sent everyone. It would be on page 10 at the start, in the middle of the second paragraph. I will read from the start of the second paragraph. It says, The Earth's vegetation is part of a web of life in which there are intimate and essential relations between plants and the earth, between plants and other plants, between plants and animals. Sometimes we have no choice but to disturb these relationships, but we should do so thoughtfully, with full awareness that what we do may have consequences remote in time and place. The reason I highlighted that on the text is because, for starters, I think it shows the start of this kind of ecological thinking, this more holistic thinking, in which there was the start of an understanding that things are interrelated, that there are consequences far beyond any single action in an ecosystem, but also the fact that Carson uses this term disturb, when she says sometimes we have no choice but to disturb these relationships. And I think that's interesting because it starts from the position that we as humans are inevitably gonna do it. But disturb may not necessarily be a negative way of doing so. So with this kind of quote, that is, let's try to, have reactions for your overall impressions on the text too. I think for this one, I would like to actually start by asking Nikki and Robin, because you suggested the text. Why do you find this text relevant, and how it has also influenced your own work?
For my part, and also from the picture chapter of the Nature Fights Back, which is really interesting. I guess like the literal quality of the writing and the way to describe relationships between non-humans, and here it's mostly insects, is really like absolutely great and impressive. And this is one of the things that we try to do, is like to be able to describe in a way that can create kinship towards those non-humans, as small as they can be and as strange as they can be for us humans. And I guess it's also part, like, of course, there is the whole part of denouncing, like, for instance, the use of pesticides like DDT that had a huge impact in terms of just politically, also in the United States, and I guess also in the whole world. But even the writing has a great value, and I guess even this part where she described all the relationship that can make the use of biological pest control interesting for farmers is really like so well described that it can almost, I guess, convince you to go for this solution instead of using pesticide. And I like also the way she's always like confronting the character of the chemist against the biologist, because in the end there was this empowerment of chemists from universities, etc., by companies like Bayer, Monsanto, etc., where no biologists were questioned at any moment. Like, there was no understanding of the biology, no understanding of the relationship. All that those people were looking for is just the best way to kill, basically, with chemicals. And this confrontation, I also think, is really interesting.
Yeah, and I think also the fact that she is a scientist. She's a marine biologist, but she's able to write in a way that really speaks to everyone. That is well translated to people who are not into science necessarily. She writes in a very poetic way, and the fact that the book itself, it actually led to bans on DDT. So it led to political action, which is also really, really relevant. And it led to the whole inauguration of the ecological movement, and it became like the piece sort of that started that movement, because of all the knowledge that she made public, and but also we believe the way she writes and the way she's able to establish a form of kinship with these non-humans, and also explain it in a certain way that you are able to understand what's actually going on, and that everything is interconnected. And she really gives a very good holistic idea of the ecosystem and how we are connected to it and how everything is connected. Yeah.
She really goes against like this modernist way of always oversimplifying systems to find easy solutions to it. And actually, this is always something that it's a question that I can't answer. But like right now, we begin to really understand more and more like all those relationships that are interesting to know also just for humans because of agriculture. And we begin to use more and more biological pest control, even though it's still marginal. But do we already have enough knowledge? Like we never cease to explore the complexity of those relationships, and the error margin is always there. For instance, there was like this toad that was introduced in Australia in the 60s as a pest control. That went out of control actually, and that is now considered as an invasive species. So like even when we do biological control, and mainly from what I understood, with vertebrates like toad, there is always this risk. Of course, it's never like black and white. It's always like a gray area. But it asks for so much knowledge, so much more knowledge actually than the use of chemicals. Like,
Yeah, and she's indeed also questioning language and the role of language in like creating oppositions against weeds, for example, which is like in general I find her writing very timeless, or like it's connected to things that we are still talking about today, or that's still relevant. Yeah, there's a lot to go into, I think, in her text. I don't know if we should go back to the quotes and focus a bit more on that.
I mean, I think this is a free-form reading room, so if anyone also has ways to respond or impressions.
Yeah, I would love to add that what I really like about her writing is that it's so observant. Like she's really a very keen reader of the landscape. And one thing that I found very well described, she does this, for example, very quickly in chapter 1, is that she knows to break through that ignorance that you have when you see a day-to-day extinction, because it's such a slow process that you almost cannot notice it. And she manages to in a sort of almost continuous way write down exactly what happens in a longer term, and makes that sort of almost a personal experience, almost a moment of reflection. I think that's very strong, because it immediately makes you as a reader realize the scale of the destruction in all these small destructive steps that are being taken throughout states. So I think that's very impressive to read that. Yeah.
I mean, I think that also leads back to something that was slightly discussed during the first online panel, which is the need to build certain narratives or use certain what amounts basically to fictions in order to get these messages across, or to make certain things more understandable to human scale. And I don't know, for me, that's something that with this text, for example, comes back over and over, with this and also the other texts, which is a question of scale. You know, about understanding that for other organisms, the relations happen on a completely different level. You know, humans might be basically moving mountains for when you go down to microbial levels. that also leads us to questions about the experience of time. What happens, in the exchange between two organisms within seconds that can have consequences that will eventually span years or decades, as was the case in the case of Carson with the use of pesticides. But I don't know, I would like to open that a little bit more to the rest of the participants. Do you have any impressions from this first quote, or from the overall impression from the text? Or commenting on the comment.
Yeah, I was thinking on what you mentioned, because, well, first of all, I was very happy to see this text selected. I find it like one of the three main pillars of environmentalist thinking, in the sense of also giving birth to the environmentalist movement, as our friends from the Soft Protest digested. Together, I think, with Limits to Growth and probably the Sun County Almanac, that it was also in the late 40s, written by Aldo Leopold. But what I like about this book, well, I found it in my father's bookshelves, the first edition, and it was very nice because it was printed with little drawings of like a butterfly and a flower and things like that. And it transported me to the time in which, for example, in Great Britain, the idea of nature writing was becoming a genre for our middle classes, and like a extended appreciation of your backyard garden, and like this. Well, this is a whole, I think, how to say, aesthetical project there, in the sense of Schiller, of education as well. And I think that the role that Rachel Carson played, as you said, bridging the scientific and the average reader, becoming bestseller and mobilizing so much, is crucial. And she also wrote about the sea. It's another book I was reading some months ago, and it's funny because it is before the tectonic plates theory, so it's like really obsolete now, but it's nevertheless very, very beautiful how she reflects on the sea. But what I wonder is about the role of the narrator. Jean, you were mentioning the narrative, or the style, that Jean Ray was mentioning, that is important to go into other spheres of thinking, into sensitivizing or sensibilizing, I don't know how to say. And I wonder now, what is our role as cultural producers? Because I think that the arts interest sometimes in the environmental question is like coming from as an outsider into the field, and therefore very often I find our role is digesting, like the reader digesting a complex set of knowledges and making them available or making them suggestive and so on. And yes, I wonder if you think that this is sometimes the role of this new, let's say, ecological term in the arts, or beyond that, like what Anne is doing with the embassies, also creating a resonance or an interpretation of the theory, embedded and embodied into practices that is beyond the transference and the digestion of scientific knowledge. Because very often I just know that ecologists will think that we are just talking very shallowly about the scientific complex understandings of, for example, the flows of energy and matter in an ecosystem. Also, that was just a reflection on our role.
Yeah, I would love to react to that, but I don't want to discourage you from reacting. But I think about the arts and the scientific point of view and the writing of Rachel Carson. I think what she does very well is to actually touch upon this qualitative experience of landscape and life, actually. And we also at Bodemzicht here at the farm, one of the frustrations my partner had, who is a Spanish biologist, was that in a study of biology, from a scientific point of view, life is also reduced to quantitative data. while life is also so much about quality, and ecology is also so much about the quality of interrelations. And I think the arts could have a very important role to play in actually also addressing that quality, in doing also qualitative research into life and ecology. And I think this might also be, Reintroduced in the book is not written as a scientific treatise, and it works also as well because it addresses this experience of quality and abundance that is then slowly being degraded into something that people find it hard to actually relate to. And yeah, that was just a thought.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think it could also be in terms of embodying the language from the scientist who is translating nature, and then the artist can be a sort of mediator between that and sort of embody this knowledge and make other people also embody the knowledge. Like, I think there's one level of understanding that you can get through a book or reading something, but then there's another understanding that you can embody, and I think that part is also really important. And I think art practices can be a way to establish this embodiment and this storing of knowledge in a different way. Yeah, but it's of course quite hard to measure, or like how efficient can an artwork be in that, or an art practice. But still, yeah, we just have to believe, I guess, that is what it is.
This discussion makes me think about, like, I don't know if you see the work of Jean Painlevé. It's like it was a photograph, I think in the 30s, 40s, 50s, I don't remember exactly, maybe during the surrealism movement. And it was basically the only guy who were like taking pictures of animals in the sea that were really artistic. And also it's part of modernity in a way, this fascination for the aesthetic of nature, of the nature world. And maybe, I don't know if he participated in creating like some empathy for those animals who were like not so well considered, I guess, because for now, like, they were seen as something quite mysterious, living in the dark, etc., from the in the sea. And I think also about like one artwork that is pretty mainstream. It was a movie. I guess it's a French movie. It's called Microcosmos. It was in the 90s. And it was really a punch in my face when I was a kid, because it was like the beginnings of the use of those really small cameras who are able to capture the life of insects, etc. And I guess these artworks, even though they are pretty mainstream, and even in general documentaries, have a huge impact in the way people consider the non-humans in the end. I don't know if it makes them change their way of behaving, but I guess it can sometimes.
I mean, something referring to text that I think Carson does show quite a bit is, for example, there's this just one sentence that says, "Most of us walk on seeing through the world," which she sort of re-emphasizes several times, and when she decides to focus on the relations between, or the chain of action and reaction between different organisms. You know, in the end, it's all about observation and slowing down, which, as I said, like on my personal reading of this kind of text, that's always something that that I take out of them. That, like, the how in order to understand these kinds of things, maybe you may need, as in her text, something that sort of translates these processes to you in the easy form of text, but to actually go and have sort of a larger communion with it, what you need to do is slow down and pay attention to your surroundings. Actually, yeah, sorry, I started drifting off. At the same time, I don't know if, because of course this is a text that was published in the 60s. So I don't know if anyone while reading it also had like a different understanding. I don't know, for starters, if everyone had read it before or knew about its importance in the ecological movement, or if some of you maybe didn't and also found it interesting compared to basically what we know now, or the mode of writing nowadays. Because I also sometimes, there are passages where I would read and think like, nowadays that would be considered a bit naive, or there would be an issue with a certain anthropomorphism, with a paternalism with the landscape. But I don't know if anyone else had that experience or approached the text differently because you had not read it before.
The first thing that comes to my mind, is that the way she describes the relationships between insects, but it's also because it's about biological pest control, still is really a super violent way to describe it, I guess. Like there is a bit like this fascination for predators, and I guess it's something that seems a bit like old school some way, like this way to describe the natural world as something really like the law of the jungle and something really violent, where there's really like no peace, and in the end not so much collaboration. Here, like what she described is mostly insects that are useful for humans, so like the collaboration is mostly beneficial to humans. But I guess it's also because she's talking about biological pest controls. Maybe if she was just speaking generally about those relationships, she will have put the focus on more peaceful relationships, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, I guess like also in the first part, the fable of tomorrow, I think like there's really a sort of romanticism going on, and maybe also anthropomorphism in the sense that you're really she's really trying to create a picturesque idea of the perfect harmony, and then she's like breaking it down again with like the opposite scenario, and I guess it's really talking to human emotions, especially in this part. Yeah, whereas like some of the other chapters are more sort of observational, or maybe less emotionally loaded somehow. Yeah, but there is something that is a bit like, yeah, that's very 60s somehow, in especially in the beginning, I think. Yeah.
But I also
you go ahead.
You go.
No, I was just gonna say, yeah, like I felt you could definitely sense the difference in the context between it being 60s. Like sometimes it felt very clear that she might have been appealing to like an American suburban context of the way she was writing. And I think the biggest difference I notice now between like the latest books that I've read that I think talk in a similar way, more of them are fiction, is just you can't really write about nature anymore without this big cloud hanging over your head. Like you don't write about nature in this sort of past, very almost romantic way anymore. A little bit focusing, weaving that into your observations. Yeah, I did feel a bit like distance from her context.
I wanted to say that I find it interesting as well, even though it's such quite older text, how relevant it still is on so many fields. And then I really like that she quoted year or something like that, saying once again we are walking in nature like an elephant in a china cabinet, which definitely feels so true still. And I find it really nice how she connects all these different dots, so that you are not saying like for example, oh, we need to, or with a different problem, like, oh, we need to save the bees because they are dying and that is a problem, but to connect it to all these different things where also people that are not necessarily loving bees, that they are also knowing why it is important. And I really like how she makes all these connections super clear and can therefore appeal to a broad audience, where you can also understand from all different points of views why it is important. And I think that also relates back to what you were talking about with artwork, where I also think it's important to not just focus on this super specific people who already understand these relationships, because I feel like often these relationships are missing. So I thought that was super interesting still, why this text also is so relevant, I guess. Yeah, that is what I wanted to say.
I think in my perception, because indeed while I was reading it, I also felt sometimes like, indeed, it feels very 60s. There's also like a weird, even if it's a critique, there's a weird optimism that sometimes now, I don't know if it's a general maybe cynicism, maybe I said that wrong, that permeates society with climate change and stuff. But I think it's also nice that I get the impression that she acknowledges this kind of position. There's this quote on page 28 of the PDF, because I realized later that it doesn't, that file actually doesn't have the page numbers. It's on the Nature Fights Back chapter, the second page, in which she states, in some quarters nowadays, it is fashionable to dismiss the balance of nature as a state of affairs that prevailed in an earlier, simpler world, a state that has now been so thoroughly upset that we might as well forget it. I mean, in that section, she acknowledges that this other position exists, you know, where what in some other instances is a romanticized idea of primordial nature or wild nature, which nowadays we know is exceedingly rare. Here is like, you know, that has not necessarily been the case. Later on that same paragraph, she states, the balance of nature is not a status quo, it is fluid, ever shifting, in a constant state of adjustment. Man, too, is part of this balance. Sometimes the balance is in his favor. Sometimes, and all too often, through his own activities, it is shifted to his disadvantage. I think I like that there's also an awareness of the possible reception and how other people think about environment with that quote. Also, I am aware that this is also a thing that happens a lot with text from the time, which is when referring to humankind, you know, writers just saying man. But I think actually in here it's appropriate to say man and his own activities. But that's just a side note.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah, Fernando, go.
First.
Okay, and I was thinking it's interesting actually how this fixer's mentality that she also addresses already, and sometimes also naively embraces, I think, when she says, oh great, bring in this beetle as a pest control, and it worked out fine. I mean, whoa, that could have serious consequences. But that this fixer's mentality is still so much there, and this engineering way of looking through this instrumental lens at nature. Yeah, in a way it's also shocking that that is still so pervasive.
Yes, no, I was just going to say that absolutely. I think that part and others is accurate in the sense of acknowledging the chaosmotic nature, no, of nature, of this is a more dark ecological view. And that at that time, it was also the first moment in which people and the scientists shown that there was evidence of DDT in the fat tissue of Arctic fauna. So I think it was pretty much like the realization of Anthropocene or Capitalocene, if you like, no? A little bit in that time. But of course, still, yes, not in the gloomy sense of these days. It's funny because the last spring, many people were saying like it was the how do you say, the noisiest spring, no? Because we humans were at home, confined. So it was a moment, it was a little bit more used as an opportunity by a lot of birds to claim, no, some sound space back. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, yes, even if DDT is banned, no, the decline on insect population is amazing. It's like, I think 70% since this book was written. So that's astounding. Yeah.
Yeah, I was also a bit curious about what you were saying, Anna, like how she's talking about how everything is interrelated and the ecology of nature, but then she kind of stops as long as it's a natural intervention. She thinks it's good. It's like natural versus chemical is very rigid in hers, like chemical is terrible. But then she's perfectly fine with them displacing species from Australia to the US to solve some other pest problem. And I was like, I really have no knowledge of this, but I was like, well, what consequences does that have? Like, I wish sometimes she had carried it further a little bit, and that it was, and I guess she's really focused on this pesticide issue, but I was like, there's certainly more going on here when they're using these methods too. Like, everything is a disturbance in a way, even if you're solving one problem with another species. So I was just a bit wondering about that, and especially for you guys as like farmers in the room, like what you think about this, and just what your thoughts were, having a little more knowledge about it.
Yeah, it's definitely. I think that what she sort of addresses is that a feeling of disconnect from the landscape and what's happening around her, and of course also a serious threat, because DDT was a serious threat to health. But what she doesn't perhaps yet address, and it's of course something we are now fully into in our Anthropocene, but it's this nature-culture divide. It's still there, and she also opposes it with the technological and the chemical and the because I mean nature is also full of chemical processes, but the man-made and the not man-made. Let's put it like that. And because that is still there as the framework and the context. You get this sort of tension moments in with this invasive beetle and with and oppositions that are perhaps not so much oppositions now anymore. So it's very telling.
Can I shortly react on that? Because I think that's also one of the things that really struck with me when I read Carson, with also the quote with "we are an elephant in this porcelain cabinet" and things like that, that we're kind of, as humans, the most disturbing species. It made me think of this book, how we fucked it all up as humans.
Wow.
And this book is also full of the rabbits that we set loose in Australia, and birds in America, and also frogs in Australia, and how we emptied lakes and created dust bowls and set fires in rivers and stuff like that. But it feels a bit outdated, like, oh, we humans are only the disturber. And what it made me question, like, how can we make a step further that humans are also part of this balance, as being part of nature, not only as like a separate entity of nature poking at this balance, but really more part of it. Because from this text and books like this, we're just like a outside aggressor, it seems. And that makes it maybe even harder to be kind of in harmony with nature or non-humans if we are in this position outside of it as a disturber.
Yeah, I think also the word disturbance, I think it's a good one to. I don't think disturbance is necessarily bad, and certainly as a farmer, I'm very conscious disturber, because you cannot farm without disturbing continuously. So as a farmer, you continuously make choices over life and death all the time. But I did like, I think it was the first quote that Sean, you shared, like the conscious disturbing. I think that's a very interesting part, because you can also facilitate a lot of life in disturbing, right? I mean, hawks also disturb, and they're followed by robins that eat in their wake of disturbance. And I mean, in ecology is all about disturbance and states of succession after disturbance. So how to disturb in a way that you're actually building and growing the capacity, the life-holding capacity of a specific biosphere, for example, instead of disturbing and degrading, which is a very different cycle. So that's a little added note from a farm perspective.
I think here I would like to use this as a slight segue into the second section of the reading room. Because exactly here we pass from Carson's text into thinking more in a slightly more general level, let's say about systems and about humans being a part of a more general ecosystem as one of several possible disturbances, or as disturbers that both deny but create spaces. And as part of this, we also have to think about how exactly do we consciously disturb, since we're getting more into this space also where a lot of speculation comes from. I would like to move into presenting one of our guests for tonight, I don't know, Light, wherever you are. Because I think in this case, Romy, who is sitting to my left on my screen, is our invited guest. She was not part of the previous session, and I think her work is good to illustrate one way of thinking of collaborations towards the future between humans and non-humans. So it feels a bit funny to do an introduction at this point in the middle, but I will just say a couple of things. So Romy, here on my screen. Romy Snijders is a Dutch multidisciplinary designer. Her work combines design, art, science, engineering, and culture. She has a very holistic approach to design, and that is that through speculative tools, her work can help tackle some of the complex and wicked problems we face today. I think you're gonna show us a little bit about your work with Symbiotic Futures, so I will not say more. And from there, I think we can get to the second part of this conversation. So please take it away, Romy.
Okay, thank you. Feels a bit funny to go from a reading room to a presentation, but I hope it's not too disturbing. Okay, can you see my screen? Yeah, okay. So I'm just gonna move this. Okay, we start. Oh, yeah, okay. Romy, yeah, we did that. Yeah, so quick introduction to Symbiotic Futures. Our current geological age, the Anthropocene, is defined by us humans having a dominant impact on the climate and the environment. That we already know. The disconnection of humans and the rest of nature is an essential part contributing to our planet's destruction. This disconnection has to do with the concept we have of nature. The concept of nature is not objective or neutral. It is socially constructed, a specific cultural model, and thus different across cultures. If stories of human exceptionalism brought us to where we are today, might stories about living in symbiosis with nature bring us to a better future? In this project, Symbiotic Futures, it explores one of those stories by using speculative design. Symbiotic Futures is a vision of the future in which we explore the language of trees through fungi and live in symbiosis with the forest to improve environmental health. In the story, it's about contributing instead of using, about care instead of fix, about interdependence instead of independence, us instead of me, give instead of take, kinship instead of mastery, and mutualism instead of parasitism. We know that trees communicate with each other through a network of mycorrhizal fungi. Fungi have networks of long threads hidden underneath the soil called mycelium. These networks form the internet of the forest. Through these networks, fungi can pass resources and signaling molecules between trees. The trees provide the fungi with 1/3 of its carbon, and the fungi give the trees the nutrients they need, such as phosphorus and nitrogen. One tree can be connected to many other trees. Looking at the relationships and the communication between trees and fungi can provide information that can be used as a bioindicator. For example, the amount of species of mycorrhizal fungi connected to one tree can tell something about the level of pollution in the forest. The main explorations in the forest include which trees are communicating, what are they communicating, and what does that mean? In the exploration, there are listening devices or these speculative tools. The first tool is attached to trees, and through different points on the trees, the tool traces incoming and outgoing communication of the tree. It shows which trees are connected and whether the tree is sending or receiving information. And then the second tool is plugged into the mycorrhizal mycelium hotspot that is connected to the trees that are communicating. The detected signals are transformed into a soundscape that can be heard and recorded. Important members of this story, or people, humans, are the foresters. People who care for, look after, and protect the forest in the interest of the forest. The forester does everything possible to understand and communicate with the forest in order to educate and inform society. And then to show a little of what this future might look like.
Symbiotic Futures. 15 years ago, humans lived in a critical time. It became clear that humans have a dominant impact on the climate and the environment. To improve our environmental health, we started to regrow nature and explore the language of nature. Hidden underneath the soil is a fungal network of threads called mycelium. This network is connected to the roots of trees and it forms the internet of the forest. This makes it possible for trees to communicate with each other. Trees have their own language. They trade, educate, and protect each other. This forester connects tracking devices to see which trees are connected and whether they are sending or receiving information. After finding the hotspot in the mycorrhizal mycelium network, the tool can be plugged into the ground. This tool transforms the detected communication in a soundscape that can be heard and recorded. Over time, these recordings can be compared to be able to better understand and have better insight in the well-being of the forest. Through open source tools, they collect and share data for the protection of our planet. We live more and more in symbiosis with nature. We understand our place in the ecosystem. Visions of the future help us to understand what decisions we make today.
Yeah, so that was a short introduction to my work or project. I don't know if that was clear, if anyone has any questions about it, or if you just want to continue the reading room.
Oh, sorry, I had a glitch there. Can everybody hear me? Okay, good. No, I want to say thank you, Romy, for the presentation. I think we had, well, I don't know about everybody else, but I think in recent years, especially with fungi and mushrooms, there's been a lot of studies and books written about it. So I think it's very interesting always to take that as a starting cue for thinking about how entities within nature communicate, but also how humans are part of those wider networks. I don't know if you could talk us a little bit more about like the research that you've done with or what has called you into this very particular how do you say that? This very particular side, like your history with mushrooms, basically.
My history.
Your interest in them, because I think that's a way to understand a bit more.
So I'm obviously very interested in many parts of nature, but when I was studying in New York at Pratt Institute, I was working on a project where I used biofabrication of mycelium. So you basically grow mycelium in a certain shape, and then you put it in the oven, and it becomes a shape. It's something like this. Then I started reading more about what I was actually using and how it worked. And then I found this book from Peter Wolleben about the hidden life of trees, and about all this other interesting information about mycelium and mushrooms. And well, those are all fungi, part of fungi. And then I was so much more interested in the living form than in the form where you let it die and it just becomes an object, that I wanted to work more on that and design sort of without necessarily using it into something that then is our object in a different way. So that is also why I chose to do speculative design, to sort of think about how we can have these different relationships, and also to share about, because I know there's a lot more written and people know a lot more about fungi nowadays, but still it's quite like, if I talk to people around me here in where I'm now, it's in Enschede, so much is still unknown. So also through this project, I tried to communicate this really interesting science that is being developed and that is still ongoing, to the broader public. Because I think what I've noticed with this kind of work is that when you show to people who do not focus on this kind of area or read about this, they first think it's some kind of weird fiction where you talk about trees that can talk to each other and they are a bit uncomfortable, like, I thought you're doing interesting stuff, but what is this? And then people start to ask these questions like, okay, what does that then mean? And what do they then say? And if I would hit a tree, would it then react to it? And then they start to sort of develop this idea of what might be there or not, which I find very interesting. So that is more and more how I got really interested into fungi, and also into these relationships and how people look at nature and experience nature, and how they can be in nature or feel more part of nature, which they obviously are. Yeah.
Can I say something? Yeah. I think it's really nice because it follows super well the text by Rachel Carson, because actually she doesn't speak so much about those relationships. There were maybe, I don't know when the real the way the mycorrhizal symbiosis functions were discovered. I have no idea, but it's really super interesting because, like, in the end, your work and the general interest in those relationships that we see in other artworks and fictions is really a demonstration that in a way it works. Like the message maybe was these relationships, maybe they were discovered, I don't know, like in the 70s or in the 80s, I have no idea. but now like they are becoming more and more public, and it went through the art world and through, for instance, your work and the work of other artists, and it's a thing now. Like it's more and more people know about this, and it's less seen, as you said, as some kind of mystical way of talking about trees, etc. It's really something that is that can be shown and that is proven. So yeah, I think it's super interesting, yeah, to see the evolution maybe of the spreading of this kind of knowledges that are really out of our sight.
Yeah, I think it's also because during the research, I also had the conversation with different foresters and managers of forests and ecologists in the city. And then because I was so excited about all this knowledge and this science that was being developed, where I also was a lot in contact with a professor from Kew Gardens and Imperial College and all this knowledge. And there's this massive gap between what is being used in cities and where there's looked at, where they are looking at maybe beds, structures for butterflies and things like that, also very important, but then not looking at all at what kind of fungal relationships are you ruining when you destroy this in this area or things like that, which is also very relatable to the text that we were just discussing, where it's like, if you do not know, then you might just ruin more than what you intend to and have to live with the consequences. Which is quite frustrating, because then you want to connect all these things, but they do not necessarily connect, because of also the way, of course, that the work field is working, where you are, which should be more like an ecology where everything is connected, but obviously, or often people are more working on their islands, I feel like. So then if you connect those, it can be, I think, much better.
Actually, have you thought of a way to exhibit this speculative design work? Like, is there a way to did you confront it to a public, maybe in where they can interact with the object, even if it's like, for instance, the sound of the mycelium network is just like also fictional? Did you try this, for instance?
Yes, but currently, since with Corona everything is online, I focused more on how to translate it to through internet. But that is definitely a part of it, because it is, I think, if you can experience something, it's way more, it will stick way better than when you just read about something or when you see it on the internet. So that is definitely a big part that I hope will be possible again when all the exhibitions and stuff are not online anymore. But it was already really interesting during the research, where I sometimes would, well, not sometimes, where I would have a speculative design experiment with people where the design tools or the tools were not designed yet, but where I would let people interact with carton, which is cardboard objects, and see how they, with some knowledge, would interact with the trees or with the forest or with the fungi or with the relationship, and how they would then build this different relationship, or how they would see and what they can already experience. So I did do tests with that, but yeah, all the shows that I've done or things so far due to Corona have all been online. But I think that would be very interesting to see how people react to it.
Can I ask a question? Because I was listening, it's very interesting what you're doing. And I was thinking about this symbiotic relationship, and I can quite easily understand or grasp like how we depend on the existence and the success of trees, as we need the oxygen, the oxygen very well. We really need it. But what I find hard to grasp is how these trees depend on us. They depend on us maybe to not cut them down, but for the rest part, I find it hard to grasp this, as trees can easily just grow and flourish on their own, right? And I was curious how you thought about that.
Well, I think because we are sort of living together in this world, it's like a interaction. So what we do has an influence on how they live, and how they live has an influence on how we live. And so I think that through trying to understand and to listen, that we can try to make, like, for example, if you have certain levels of, well, this is a bit of a weird example, but if you know that the fungal levels, for example, are going down, and then you can say, okay, we need to have 3 car-free days because we have too much pollution in this forest, and therefore we need to bring it down, otherwise these trees cannot live well. Or maybe it can be creating like different, for example, we often create lanes of similar trees with a monoculture, and then that is not good for those trees either, even though they are being planted. Like, it would be way better if they have not monoculture, but multicultural. And so I think that there are many things that we can do to try to make it better, or to at least have this kind of different relationship. I don't know if that makes sense, what I'm saying.
There, I would like to add, referencing a text that was not in the on the list, but I reread recently, with the Mushroom at the End of the World by Anthropocene. Now there's, you know, like the whole thing with just as there's a usually erroneous thought about there being a certain pristine primordial nature out there somewhere, or somewhere in the past. This thought that, you know, humans are the ones that are like the complete opposite to whatever nature is. Like when you try to understand it more as this web of disturbances, you see that things that right now we consider relatively natural, like forests in Norway, pine forests in Norway, have actually been affected for millenniums because of human disturbances that back then may have been tiny things, like just, you know, marking certain paths through the woods or chopping down very specific trees that then allowed for certain mushrooms to sprout, that then allowed for certain trees to grow. But, you know, like it has a lot to do with the generalizations also. Like, it's not that all trees will bloom if there were no humans. It's more that certain disturbances will give space for certain trees to grow over others. So I don't know, to tie in a little bit into the other text that was in the link, in this case, Jane Bennett's Vibrant Matter. I think to go a little bit back, you know, also with the exercise with which I wanted to start, which was each of us naming like a non-human entity. This idea in her chapter, Political Ecologies, where she refers back to, for example, Darwin's idea of small agencies with other species. After all, when we think of these other animals or plants or landscapes, elements of the landscape, or in this case, fungi and trees, often it becomes about letting these organisms or entities to tell their own story, or tell their story from their perspective, which of course as humans we end up translating, and that's where some other things as narrative and fiction start. But in the end, it's about giving a voice from that side, which takes me to some of these questions that I think are very nice. No one has to answer them, but I think it's good to keep in mind. At the start of Jane Bennett, on the very first page of the chapter, it says, even if, well, she refers, of course, to Darwin's observation of worms and their importance to soil and for their ecosystem. And she says, even if a convincing case is made for worms as active members of, say, the ecosystem of a rainforest, can worms be considered members of a public? What is the difference between an ecosystem and a political system? Are they two names for the same system at different scales? What is the difference between an actant and a political actor? And a little bit below, are there non-human members of a public? These are all very, very general questions that we're not going to solve in the next 40 minutes. If we do, I think we should write to the Nobel Prize Committee. But I don't know, starting from there, what are your impressions from Bennett for starts? Or do you have any thoughts at all about these very general questions?
Yeah, I would love to react, because I just heard you said like also giving a voice to non-humans, and it's also some kind of language that we used in the embassy the first years, and we don't do it anymore for the reason that non-humans already have a voice. It's just that depends on your perspective and how you listen, and I mean listening in a very broad way, not only with your ears but with everything. Could be with your microscope or whatever. So actually the question more becomes, how can we listen to those voices that are actually already there, but that we didn't notice, or we didn't have instruments, or we didn't have consciousness, or we didn't have the moment in scientific history. And how then do you then relate it to the current human political system that we have built? And I think a question underlying these questions by Bennett is also like, what do you actually define as human? Because I think what very interesting is that the image we have of ourselves as human beings is at the same time dissolving when we start to ask these kinds of questions. Because am I actually very clear-cut, discernible individual that is not that exists so-called in an environment? The word itself already assumes that I'm not part of it. So the nice thing I think about these questions is that you can feel that there's a very, very fundamental shift underlying these questions, which both concerns the image that we have of the human self and of and our worldview connected to that. And that's also to answer the question in the chat, which I think was also a very good question, like who is we here? Well, I think obviously we are speaking, unless somebody doesn't agree, but about the people in global north. Lots of indigenous communities already know for centuries that nature and culture and humans are intertwined. They don't even necessarily have a word for nature as we tend to have. So it's very interesting. Another thought I just had, because somebody mentioned just with your work, Romy, how it also refers to how we continuously keep moving the goalpost. So what is happening there? So finally we decided, oh, there are orang-utans that use tool use. So there are other beings with cognitive values. And then you can see in scientific history that's continuously shifted. Then, okay, so there are beings with tool use, but that doesn't mean that they are human. Perhaps there are some beings that use tools. It might be octopuses with coconuts, but that doesn't make them, we keep our border. And then, oh, emotion. Oh, suddenly we discover that there are rats that actually love when you tickle them. Oh, we thought emotion was something purely for humans. And it turns out that there are all these other beings that have also emotional capacities. Okay, we need to shift the goalpost again. What is it that actually makes us discernibly human? Oh, we're finding out that actually there are bonobos that are more intelligent than we ever could imagine, and they could fill in these whole screens and they could do mathematics. Okay, what do? We shift the goalpost. Oh shit, plants have intelligence. What do we do now? We shift the goalpost again. Hey, fungi. Turns out that they also do in economics. So the interesting thing that I see here is not so much that we continuously, because we're going to find out soon another microorganism that is amazing, bacteria that are. The interesting thing that I find is that we continuously keep asking that question. Why are we looking so hard to see ourselves as something completely discernibly unique, separated from the rest of the world? And that is exactly the kind of question I think that underlies this nice sum up. You could see as sub-questions. Okay, what is then a public? What is a community? What is politics? That comes forth from these borders that we have moved so far now into the Anthropocene that we cannot discern this two anymore, because where in climate change does nature end and culture begin, and where in your own body is that even happening? So yeah, just as a reflection.
I think we're all processing.
Yeah, I was thinking about this, and I think that now we sort of, with a political sphere, we've moved so far that everything or every entity that can voice its opinions in the way that we understand it can be part of the political. But then the border becomes even vaguer. Sorry, I'm outside, but since, for example, babies or older elderly people with dementia also have trouble voicing their opinion or voicing their needs, and then I think this even further blurs the line about what can be or what should be and how it should, these people or these non-human entities can be represented within a political system.
Well, related with that, well, first of all, I think this book by Jim Bennett is amazing and superb to also start a political philosophy and actually a political ecology, you know, that is beyond the inherited concepts about the political subjects, no, and and expanding it to actants. And I love to read this book. It's also beautiful how she managed to go through all the different references, no, from Rancière to Dewey and like classical political genealogies and taking it much further to new materialisms. But I was trying to think on an example. I don't know, because these days, as I don't know, I mentioned last time we spoke, I worked for many years with the pastoralist movement and the nomadic peoples, and we are now in a huge debate within the movement and with the public opinion in general and with the other actants that it's about the wolf and the presence of wild predators expanding in Europe, or at least in Spain, is not considered an endangered species. And this huge debate is like really making a confrontation between, for example, people, unfortunately, it starts to be like separated like that. People who live in the cities with a vision of voicing the wolf and about the protection of the wolf, and people who live in the rural and pastoralists very often, like with beautiful messages, sometimes speaking for the wolf, saying, well, actually, what the wolf wants, for example, is a diversity on the populations, on males that exchange. I mean, like the real danger for the population of wolves is related with endogamics, no, and the lack of diversity of genes and so on. And the fact that they were explaining, no, to the health of a whole ecosystem is beyond the health of an individual species. In this case, not only humans, but of course wolves, no, and they were talking about the complexity and so on. So yeah, this is the question. No? It's like, of course, there are other actants that have a huge influence and a huge presence. In this case, it's the closest predator in the food chain to us. But then the way in which it's voiced is really, really like opposite positions, no, a spectrum, and we have this big conflict. So I wonder, no, if scientists even don't have a clear position. So WWF scientists say something. Scientists that have been working on census of wolf populations and so on think in another way about the possibility of managing a certain form of the population and establishing controls. So yeah, I don't know. Do you have any experience on how, in this case, a super splitted way of voicing political ecologies can be resolved, because of who has the righter voice or the closest voice to the other voice?
I mean, I think something that Anne said that I can agree with a lot is that it's not so much precisely about voicing, but about then listening, because those voices already exist. But then, as a general question, what would that listening mean? For example, in terms of human scale political organization, because often this listening also means slowing down, which is something that in general in the global north we don't seem to be good at doing. When we were reading the text, there was like a, then again, the last year, for example, has been a relative slowdown, a little bit enforced slowdown by a non-human, and depending on who you ask, non-living agent. So for example, as a general question, in the last year where there has been a general slowing down, has that had an effect on this listening to non-human communications, voices? I don't know what to call. Besides the coronavirus, whose voice is now very well heard.
Yeah, everybody was doubting that non-humans were actors.
Yeah, exactly.
Convinced. No, I do certainly think so. I mean, I've never seen so many people actually paying attention to other beings than in the corona period, even if it's just like sparrows in their garden or whatever. So yeah, I think there has been a shift there, but I think for this listening we need much more than just time. We need methods, we need instruments, we need everything we can, because it's going to ask a lot from us. If you see that we are already struggling with listen to human minority groups, by gosh, tried listening to a parasitic tick. I mean, where do you start? Yeah. So it's a huge challenge, and it will really ask us also to listen in all the ways we can listen. So the embodied listening, I think that's also a very good one. If you have embodied knowledge of how to read a landscape, how to understand a community. What I find very interesting with the Embassy of the North Sea project is that we have scientists that come to us to do research with us, not because they want to do scientific research with us, because they have their institutions for that, but because they have a very specific kind of knowledge of the topic they are researching, whether this is a species or a specific kind of migration pattern or whatever, that they cannot put in the form that they have been given by the scientific community, which is either an Excel sheet or a paper or a thing. And the same goes for politics. If you read political reports, it's a very specific kind of language, but also a very specific kind of form of what data actually enters those reports that feed the policies. So I think one of the challenges we are facing now when it comes to listening is that we really need to broaden the spectrum of skills and instruments and methods and with which we listen. And we need as much the scientific community for that as we need the artistic community, because we need as much imagination as the representational part. And yeah, it is super challenging, and it will also be weird. I was thinking about, I think Nikki or Robin, I don't know, said, mentioned empathy, but there's only so much empathy you can have for zooplankton. So there's also I mean, I'm really charmed by the idea of empathy. I think it has a great beauty and potential for care in it, but I don't think it's empathy that's gonna it shouldn't be a prerequisite for interacting with non-humans on a serious level, for taking non-humans serious as full-fledged members of our society. Because for once, all the non-emphatic people, and we had some great non-emphatic leaders over the last years, they don't give a shit. And then there's also the thing that empathy can only bring you so far. So this image that you have, the circle, the concentric circle that you expand, so you start from humans and then you give chimpanzees legal personhood, and perhaps in 500 years we may give legal personhood to insects. It doesn't I think that's not the way necessarily to go. So what I think is, it's a thought could be to really reconsider also our self-interest. Because also you could say the rights of nature movement is also a lot about self-interest, because in the Anthropocene, the new ego is eco. It is. I am interconnected, and for my own subsistence, I am interdependent upon many other beings, and it's so complex. Where Rachel Carson, of course, touches upon that, I don't even know which species I'm interdependent on, and to start to figure that out and to shift politics, and I think that's where it becomes interesting in not only representing human individual interests or nation states' interests, but also try to shift politics so we can start to represent relations instead of individuals or species or nation states. Relations that are actually situated in a specific place, because these relationships are specific to a community. Like the European eel that lives in France is a different European eel community grounded in Zeeland. So that also means that our politics should be way more biocultural specific and sort of bottom up. And yeah, these are just a little bit broad, but I think the thing we are addressing, and I think Bennett is certainly hitting up on that, is that actually it's a fundamental shift to do the listening others. I think we are in the transition period of a paradigm transition in which we need to not only shift our worldview but also our self-image, and then from that new image of self and worldview, we can build institutions that actually befit the challenges that we are facing now. And one of them will be politics. So that's why I also think this is not, even though I applaud the initiative, I don't think this is going to be solved with the Partij voor de Dieren. Because I really think that it is way more fundamental than that.
Yeah, I agree. And I think you see this in our inability to care for like minority groups who can speak in a way that we recognize. And yeah, just a thing I struggle with when I'm thinking about Bennett's text is this idea of bringing nature into our system. Like, how do we represent nature into our system? Like, we don't do that. Like, it wouldn't work, and it would never work. And so, yeah, it's just, I think that question has its own ignorance of how fundamentally flawed our system is, not only for our own species of humans, but for our whole ecologies of who and what we're related to. I think, yeah, there's deep problems. And I think when you begin to think about this question of how how to incorporate nature into our system. It's like, oh, why would nature doesn't want to be in our system? Like our system could never care for nature in a way that's productive. Like, yeah, there are so many humans that aren't even cared for, and yeah, it's just, yeah, that's my main thing I think about Venice. It's just, yeah, you just recognize how fundamental this change needs to be, and it goes completely back to our way of seeing people. And when I'm saying our and we, I mean like a white imperialist modernist subject. Just our way of seeing is so flawed that's why we're in the situation we're in. But yeah, that's very heavy.
There's that explosive quote in the text, right? In Bennett's text, where she says, "For while every public may very well be an ecosystem, not every ecosystem is democratic." That one I'm gonna frame and put somewhere in the house.
Yeah, concerning like shifting politics, I think it's also really interesting to shift from voices and listening towards action, or then also ecosystems, what you were calling. But like Bennett also writes about Rancher, and it struck a chord with me because in my master thesis I also used the theories of Rancher and his idea of finding your political voice by making yourself heard and visible, like changing what is visible in society. And the example of the like stateless people who like the sans-papiers in Paris, I think, who demonstrated or just physically joined political demonstrations on the streets that were about very different topics, but they just joined in public space, which made them visible and made them then led to them being also a political actor. While they were not part of the political system as it was formally recognized, because they didn't have citizenship. So I find that also really interesting that Jane Bennett writes about the possibility to just be a political actor because of your action, and it really doesn't matter if you're then non-human or human, because the actions also voice your interests. So yeah, I find that really interesting, that already like this order of who is visible and who is powerful and heard is already shifting just because non-humans and nature are acting. And we don't even have to listen to them or voice their interest. They are already very, very active. So, but then our concept of politics indeed really needs to change.
Yeah, and I do think that listening is an action. I don't think it's passive. So there I was also thinking about, Fernando, your wolf polarization problem, which I can really imagine. I've seen wolves hanging from the lampposts in Spain, shot. Yeah, it was amazing. I think, yeah, it could be interesting also to organize something like that, like a listening to the wolf session with the people with opposite views on the wolf. And there's this, I don't know, this amazing article on what happened to Yellowstone after they reintroduced the wolves. I don't know if you know that they describe this economic interaction, sort of this chain reaction of what the wolf actually brought to the table, and then in the end rivers start to stream again, and it's like amazing. So it could also broaden up the perspective a little bit, to not be focused on one player, but to see what it could actually bring to have such a, to listen to such a voice. So yeah, that was another little bit sidetracked, but
I also want to say that I really liked what you said, and about like giving the agency back to, for example, communities and like make them take decisions on conservation, which I guess is already happening in indigenous communities. We see that, for example, in the Amazon, and I think that's a really powerful move to sort of reduce the scale a bit and not talk about politics. Of course, like politics on a bigger global level is also important, but I like this idea of giving back the agency to indigenous communities, to citizens, to non-humans, to whatever, like is really relevant and also suggests a different sort of democracy, or a different sort of structure that I think need to move towards, definitely. But I really agree with that notion. Super relevant, yeah.
Anne, what you said was really beautiful, and it stayed with me thinking, because, for example, well, this not so long ago, I was working with an indigenous community, the Tarahumara people in northern Mexico, Raramuri, and they hardly speak, and it's because it was a strategic way to really escape from, the predation and imposition. Like silence was a space of resistance. And nevertheless, yes, they claim their territory, but what they mean is like, in a reading group and in a discussion group like this, in which also we very often are like sharing validation systems, from the academia and so on. How could we start as well, to get closer to other forms of knowledge, of validation of the experience? That peasant and indigenous knowledge is very much based on trial and error, and making, and this is the notion of coevolution, that you do something to the forest will do something to you, and then you learn what you shouldn't do if you want to not to, I don't know, lose your children. So I mean, there was millennia of learning in many senses, and I wonder, because this is a debate, for example, that happens a lot in agroecology. Agroecology is the science of also bringing other perspectives and having a dialogue face to face with the non-scientists. But then it is like there is a critical moment of identity crisis, saying, do we always have to validate that other knowledge through the academic and scientific knowledge, and articulate it somehow? So yes, it's very, very nice that you brought in the question of just the presence, and the action as another level of transferring, and the basic one to transfer agency, actually, but it's sometimes difficult because there is the UN system, for example, and we will talk about this with this IPCC, that is so much about having a voice and taking the floor and so on, and for some are really excluded from that.
I think, as always happens with reading rooms, like these texts you could unpack them forever. And of course, we have opened now several Pandora's boxes of questions. However, I think we're nearing the point of starting to close up a little bit. So I would say this is a good moment to start throwing out their questions, notes, propositions, statements, or silence, and listening. So I don't know if anyone has prevailing questions or parts that you would like to get the attention to. I don't know if some of the people who have been really acting through listening throughout also have any other consideration. If not, I would actually like to wait. lost my note. Here. Well, I can say that from this I really take apart. I think I'm gonna be in silence, rethinking a lot about listening as an action. Of course, you cannot really extract yourself from the system. So I don't know. For me, this is really a lot about rethinking disturbance from both a personal, like becoming more conscious with these little small acts of looking, going back to Carson or to other nature writers, identifying just yourself in your own surroundings. But I think it's really interesting what we've been discussing about the larger political systems, especially the consideration that no political system can properly, no humanly made political system can properly encompass nature. In its own sense, it's extractive by itself to do that. So I guess it comes back to a certain negotiation of disturbances.
Yeah, and I would like to add one thing, because one thing I really liked about her text is that there's a lot of fear for anthropomorphism, but she also sees it as a strength. And I really like that. So she, at page 99, she says, in a vital materialism, an anthropomorphic element in perception can uncover a whole world of resonances and resemblances. Sounds and sights that echo and bounce far more than would be possible were the universe to have a hierarchical structure. We at first may see only a world in our own image, but what appears next is a swarm of talented and vibrant materialities, including the seeing self. So I thought it was actually nice that she also saw the strength of anthropomorphism there.
There is something to be said. I have to admit, I don't remember where I read this, but there's in a lot of folk tales, either animals or trees or elements of the landscape speak or interact with each other. In some, they are even the main characters. Like in my own reading, as of late, I've been reading Estonian folk tales every day. They have like a compilation, and this comes on a lot. Like these are folk tales that 100 years ago were what people would be telling each other, and non-humans would often be the center stage, which gives you a different way of relating to these others, to these entities, to these organisms. And at some point, this kind of folktale, this kind of parable became children's stories, where you cannot take it seriously because it's an animal or it's a plant or it's a tree. That made me reconsider a lot, how many novels have I read where the main character is non-human? How many songs have I heard that where, it's not, it's a love song, but it's between magpies. Or maybe we hear it every day, no? I don't know. But yeah, I think that's a nice, there's also power in anthropomorphism. But all right, do we have any other last comments for the session? Speak now or listen forever. Okay. Actually, before we end, I would like to put a link on the chat, which is what Fernando was mentioning, the IPCC, which is taking part, it's starting tomorrow actually at the Jan van Eyck online. I think a lot of these conversations will probably find tangents and continue during the program. I know part of the Frame team and also part of this panel, including the Soft Protest Digest and Fernando as part of Inland will be there. So I think that's also a nice way to continue. And well, with nothing left to say, I would like to thank everyone for joining today. I know that at least on my part, I leave a lot of things to consider and entertain. I hope for you too. So yeah, thanks everyone for joining, and hope we can continue these conversations on later instances, maybe sometime not online.
That would be nice. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.